Welcome to Divisionalysis, I'm Fog. Today is the last in the series on the weapon damage talents for assault rifles series. We have got a mixed bag of talents today, a named weapon and an exotic included. We better get into it. Let's go. Now today's eclectic mix of talents is going to push our control setup to its limits, and that mixed bag of talents today looks like this. We have a grenade activated talent, we have one of the hardest to understand and therefore the most misunderstood talents, we've got one that isn't even a damage talent, and we've got a headshot damage talent as well. Now spoiler alert, one of these talents is the most useless in the game. You'll have to wait to find out which one it is. We're going to start off with Sledgehammer. Dealing damage with a grenade applies a mark on a target. Targets with that mark will take 30% more damage to armor. So that is, even if you have damage to armor on your build, that target will take 30% more damage and have a negative 20% movement speed. It also has the time factor where it will expire after 10 seconds. And if we look at the damage, regardless of whether you have damage to armor on the build or not, Sledgehammer is going to provide you a 30% amplified damage to your build when you are applying damage to targets with the mark, and that damage to armor counts. Now it's an interesting characteristic of Sledgehammer that it is not just armor that it applies to. We'll cover that in a second, but let's just look at the activation. Here I've got my test build on, which has damage to armor on with contractor's gloves, and it provides consistent numbers for damage to health and damage to armor, and what we can see here is that consistency. I'm going to throw a grenade. We have Gunner on. The unfortunate characteristic of Gunner is that its specialty grenade does not deal damage, which is part of the activation of Sledgehammer. You must deal damage with your grenade. Now it is only Gunner that this applies to, because every other specialization, even the flash grenade and even the disrupt grenade, will deal damage to a target activating Sledgehammer. So for Gunner we have to swap over to the explosive grenade or the concussion grenade in order to deal damage. If I deal damage to the red, which only has health, you can see that there's no difference in the damage numbers. Whereas when I apply it to an armored target, dealing damage to that, I get a full 30% amplified damage to the armor portion. Now you can activate Sledgehammer and also switch away to a different weapon in order to get some additional benefit as well. So there is that. And I don't think it's any surprise to people now. It's been pretty much common knowledge, but Sledgehammer also applies to armor plate. You can see that I'm getting the 30% extra damage over what would normally be health damage. If you watch my video on armor plate, understand that if an enemy has health behind armor plate, it will take health damage. But here's the interesting part. I'm now doing pure health damage to this armor plated enemy, but I am still getting all of the full Sledgehammer benefit. It seems that the coding allows me to do Sledgehammer damage to the target because they've programmed the armor plate to take the damage of the target. And here they're on an armored shield bearer. I'm not getting damage to armor or damage to health because there is armor behind the armor plate. You can find out more in that other video that I made. But once I get rid of the shield, we're back to doing normal armor damage, and now we're doing just straight health damage, seeing those consistent numbers. But here, if we go to a health-based enemy carrying armor plate, the plate is taking health damage, You can see no change in numbers when I kill the target regardless. But now watch when I apply Sledgehammer, the shield will take the additional 30%, but also the health of the target as well will take the Sledgehammer bonus damage. So it appears that Sledgehammer applies to armor, but also armor plate, and to the enemy if they're carrying or wearing armor plate. But at the end of the day, we're probably only going to be able to use it once per wave. Probably at the very first point of entry is going to be the best for surprise, and where you're going to have maybe 5 to 6 enemies that are targetable. But not all of those enemies that are targetable are going to be able to be hit with a single grenade, and then even those enemies, probably about 50% of them, Sledgehammer isn't going to apply to them, and even if it does apply to them, you're probably only going to see about 60% armor in regards to those targets. So look, ballpark, we're going to say for an individual solo player, you're probably going to get about 10 to 15% value from Sledgehammer if you're using it as your damage talent, which is going to result in about 3 to 5% being added to your overall damage output. It's grenade impact activated, and because of that, it is also limited to your grenade capacity, and as we saw in the case of Gunner, it was also the type. It must deal damage. But the thing about that as well is that when, obviously there's the time to throw the grenade, but also the damage that's done by your grenade, it's going to be done to the armor in the first instance. So the amount of armor that's left is going to be reduced. So it's going to reduce the value of a Sledgehammer as well, if you're using a purely damaging grenade. The advantages are that it's applicable to the hardest enemies, to all of the hardest enemies. All of our boss enemies and named enemies and rogues and hunters, they all wear armor or armor plate of some description. As the difficulty increases, the amount of armor that enemies wear and the amount of armor plate that enemies wear increases, but also as the difficulty increases, the enemies become much more adept at actually avoiding grenades altogether. The thing about Sledgehammer is it's not really an individual talent. The talent applies to an enemy, not the player. And what that means is that you can get huge or multiplication of that damage in a group situation because it applies to the enemy. So in group play, a single player who procs Sledgehammer has the capacity to increase damage by over 100% as far as the individual contribution is. 30% damage, or if we're talking perfect Sledgehammer, 40%, multiplied by 4 players, or in the case of Countdown, up to 8 players. That is a massive multiplication factor of damage. So in group play, Sledgehammer may be one of the best group damage talents that there is. But for an individual and solo player, it's probably one of the lowest. So let's move on. Measured, one of the more difficult talents to understand its value, and I'm going to try and break it down to make it easy to digest, but it affects 3 different aspects of damage, and that is that rate of fire, which affects time of delivery. You've also got its negative aspects in regards to weapon damage, but then it also has total weapon damage at the end of the magazine. 3 different aspects all combining into one damage talent. But let's go with the first aspect, and that is the negative attribute of weapon damage. And I think this is the easiest one to get confused about because on an all-red build, you have quite an amount of damage. Now with diminished returns, if we were adding damage at the 140% mark, which is what our current weapon damage is, we would gain 12.5% in value. So the 30% added would only result in 12.5% actual damage output. The same diminished return aspect works in our favor in regards to measured, but instead of working from the 140% mark, we have to go back to where it takes us, which is the 110% mark. So the 140 minus the 30% weapon damage that measured is taking from us in the first half of the magazine takes us back to 110, which means that we're losing 14.28% from our build, not 30%, which I've seen confusion around before. So if we break that down to our first half of the magazine, we're going from 140% weapon damage down to 110% damage, which takes us from our control amount of 456 down to 399.57% output, which is negative 14.28%. So our damage output is reduced by 14.28% in the first half. In the second half, our control build has no total weapon damage talents, which means that total weapon damage at this point is a brand new multiplying box, which is acting as pure amplification of damage, and it gives us a full 30% damage output increase in the second half of the magazine. Now, if we had other total weapon damage talents on the build, let's say Vigilance or Obliterate, we'd already have 25% on our build, which would mean that our 30% total weapon damage would actually only be increasing our damage output by 24%. If we had both Obliterate and Vigilance on the build, our total weapon damage would be sitting at 50, which would mean that our second half of the magazine for measured would only deliver an additional 20% damage output. That's still massive, but it would be reduced. So let's break this down as simply as I possibly can. First half of the magazine, we're losing 14.28% to our damage output. In the second half of the magazine, we're gaining 30% damage to our output. But we then have a time factor that's involved, rate of fire. So if we take our control, it's going to deliver 50 bullets over 100% of the time it would normally take it to deliver that amount. For measured, we have two halves to the magazine, each with 25 bullets in them. If there was no rate of fire change, it would just be 25 bullets in 50% of the time, and the second half would be 25 bullets in 50% of the time. But we have 20% added rate of fire in the first half. Now, that means that we're delivering our 25 bullets in 80% of the time, which is half, so now we're delivering that in 40% of the time. And in the second half, it's now taking us 20% longer, and 20% on top of 50 is 60. So the first half is 40% of the time, the second half is 60% of the time. There is no difference in the time to output those 50 bullets if we're firing all of the magazine. It's exactly the same amount of time. It's just when we compare that to our control, in 40% of the time, our control build has only delivered 20 bullets. In the 60%, it's delivered 30 bullets. So that's how we're going to compare them in those two lots. 40% of the time, and then the last bit is the 60% of the time for the last half. Now, if we do that comparison, our control build in that first 40% delivers 20 bullets, and it's delivering those 20 bullets at 100% of its normal damage, which means that it will give you 20 bullets damage. In the next half, I use in inverted commas, but the next 60%, it's going to deliver 30 bullets at 100% of their normal value, delivering 30 bullets value. When it comes to measured, in that first 40% of the time, it's going to deliver 25 bullets, but it's going to be doing that at 85.72% of their normal value. But what that means, if we were to compare it to the control, is that it will deliver 21.43 bullets worth of damage as compared to the control. Now, with the first bullet principle, that reduces slightly because it's got a slight deficit to start off with, meaning that it's delivering the equivalent of 21.29 bullets in that same period of time, which means that the first half of the magazine, we are getting 6.44% more damage delivered in that 40% of the time. The second half of the magazine, or the 60% of the time, taken to empty the magazine. We are now delivering only 25 bullets as opposed to 30, but we're doing so at 130% the damage. 25 by 130 means that it's delivering the equivalent of 32.5 bullets in that same amount of time. Both the control and the measured build will lose approximately half of their last bullet to overkill, or the last bullet principle, if you've watched my other videos, meaning that the control build will deliver on average 29.5 bullets and the measured will deliver 31.85 bullets. So it suffers slightly more by increasing the damage at the back of the magazine, but it still means that it is delivering 31.85 bullets worth of damage as opposed to 29.5, which means that in this last 60% of time for the magazine, measured is now delivering 7.97% more damage than the control. We are using the full portion, or a full magazine, when we're doing multi-target damage, and on a 6 red build we're doing that around about 35% of the time. So across the whole magazine we're averaging 7.2% more damage than the control at 35% of the time. And if we're doing single target damage, we're using approximately 60% of the magazine, which averages out to be 6.7% more damage added. We're doing that 65% of the time. So for multi-target it adds 2.52%, for single target 4.355%, which means that measured on average for a 6 red build is going to give you almost 7% more damage output. I can show you this very simply in a comparison between measured and optimist. The only thing that changes in between these two demonstrations as they're side by side is that I have literally just changed the talent, so everything else stays the same, and the only other variance that you're going to see is when the third reload for gunner kicks in. It might kick in one magazine earlier for one of the weapons, but then that will be rectified very shortly after with the other one getting that same buff. And as you can see here, over time these magazines are outputting their damage in exactly the same amount of time. The only variation is those gunner reloads, and what you can see is at the end measured has delivered more damage than what optimist has. And when we're using the full magazine, both optimist and measured will deliver 50 bullets in exactly the same amount of time. So they both reach their striker stacks full capacity at exactly the same time. If, however, we're taking down targets and reloading prior to using the whole of the magazine, which we will do roughly 2/3 of the time, it's a very different story. During that first 40% time where you're delivering 25 bullets in 20% less time, you're still doing more damage. But on top of that, what you've also done is you've added 5 additional bullets to that amount of time where you are stacking anything on your build that requires stacking at a rate of 5 to 7% faster. Technically, it's 20% faster during that first 40%, if that's all you were using, but we'll generally tick over to that next portion of the magazine, using around about 60% of our magazine to take down enemies. So we are ticking into the total weapon damage and the reduced rate of fire period. So on average, you're still going to be upscaling your stacking damage talent by potentially 5 to 7% faster. And if I freeze it at this endpoint here, measured has reached full stacks for strikers. Optimus is still a magazine away from reaching those full stacks. Measured suffers very little at all, as in fact gaining an advantage by firing less than the full magazine, whereas Optimus is not reaching its full capacity of damage because it is undershooting the magazine prior to reaching its full damage capacity. At this end point here, Measured is now delivering a full 6% more damage. Now, on top of the stacking benefits that Rate of Fire delivers, Rate of Fire actually improves stability of a weapon as well, and I can show you that here. A weapon is programmed to kick and fall back into place, and here with the AK I can continue to do that over and over and over again and get essentially through a single bullet's width. I can get 100% accuracy if I allow that weapon to go through its natural rise and fall back to its original spot. We use automatic fire. The weapon is programmed to kick at a certain point, and that certain point is generally at the peak of the recoil pattern. And so this diagram here, we see the initial kick and then it's the rise and fall. But when we're using automatic fire, the next bullet's kick will kick in at this point, increasing the rise, and it happens again and rise. So overall, over those 3 bullets, the weapon will have risen by this much if we didn't control it. If we then shorten the distance between the kicks, as in we've increased the rate of fire, so the distance between, or the time difference between the 2 kicks is reduced, what happens is that arc of recoil starts sooner, meaning that after 3 kicks, what we have is a reduction in the overall size of the recoil of that weapon, meaning that it is easier to control. So I don't know where we ever got the idea that measured wasn't a good talent, because as stock standard it's returning almost 7% extra damage over our control amount. It's easy to use, it is point and shoot. There is some difficulty in managing the varying rates of fire because you are getting that greater stability at the beginning of the magazine. But this talent is one of the very rare ones that actually has more value on higher weapon damage builds because diminished returns is working in our favour. It does have less value on total weapon damage talent builds like Obliterate, Vigilance and Focus. But at the beginning of the magazine, that increased stability and the increased rate of fire means that you are getting more rounds on target at the start of the magazine or at the start of an engagement where you're startling enemies. That's going to increase that damage amount again. But what it also leads to, in my experience, is that there's an increased temptation to reload more often than probably what is optimal. But you've got a base level of 7%, you've got an increased rounds on target at the beginning of an engagement, and if you have a stacking mechanic on your build, during that initial phase you are stacking at 20% the rate of other talents, but on average you're going to be gaining an extra 5 to 7% more stacks during the time it takes you to kill an enemy. But on most stacking mechanic talents, that amounts to an additional 1% damage. If you add Obliterate and also Strikers as well, you're talking close to 2% extra per stack. This is the reason why a higher RPM weapon is much better on a stacking mechanic build. But in the case of measured, it provides a greater ability to do this even on a high RP. So measured at stock standard 7%, but in all reality, on most damage builds, this is going to return much greater than that. The same rate of fire bonus, though, applies to other rate of fire mechanics, and there is one assault rifle that has the capacity to do so. Allegro will also increase rate of fire, and the only assault rifle that it is available on is in the perfect form, delivering 12% rate of fire, and that's on the invisible hand. If we analyse the damage that's added by Allegro, it actually amounts to 0% damage. Rate of fire is a time talent. It reduces the time in which you take to deliver that damage. So on a standard build, our damage is divided by our time to fire and reload, and on our control, that is 65% firing time and 35% reloading. In the case of the invisible hand, 100% of its damage is now delivered in the firing time down to 57.2% of the total time, and the reload remains the same, which means that the invisible hand is delivering its damage in a faster rate amounting to an 8.45% increase on its damage output. So the invisible hand, once again, very, very easy, point and shoot. The value is delivered all in the firing phase, so it's delivered all as burst damage to the enemy, and it comes with that rate of fire and increased stability on you being able to deliver that damage as well. The only downside to this talent is that it is only available on the invisible hand. But if the AUG is something that you're looking at, then the invisible hand is an excellent option with an 8.45% increase on damage output over the standard AUG. Few other talents are able to deliver as much with the consistency that Allegro does, and deliver it all in damage, which is unlike our next talent. Our next talent, Fast Hands, once again, not a damage talent, adding 0% to your actual bullet damage. Once again, Fast Hands is a time talent, this time not for the firing side of things, but for the reloading side of things. Our control is 65% firing and 35% reloading, but our control has Gunner. And with Gunner, every third reload is already receiving 50% reload speed. It works out to be 100% of its normal time is for the first and second reloads, and its third reload will be at 66% its original speed. But what benefit is Fast Hands offering? Well, we have a 50 round magazine. We're generally going to hit about 60% of our rounds out of that magazine, and Fast Hands is hit reliant. Now, of those 30 hits that we're actually doing, 59% of them will be critical hits, meaning that across a full magazine, 18 critical hits is what we can imagine on average we will deliver. But we're only firing the full magazine 35% of the time. When we are taking down single targets, we're generally using about 60% of our magazine. We're doing this type of firing about 65% of the time. 30 rounds is what we'll average as being fired, 18 hits is what we'll average as far as on target, and 59% of those will be critical hits, meaning we'll average 10.5 critical hits per target. On average, with our 35-65 split, we're probably going to average around 13 critical hits per magazine before we reload. At 4% reload speed per critical hit, that amounts to 52% on average. For a standard reload, that 52% reload bonus will take us down to about 65% of its original speed, and when we're on our third reload with Gunner, it will take us down to about 45% of its original speed. So if we're comparing it to our control, Gunner is 100% of its normal reload time for the first and the second, and 66 for its third, totaling 266% reload speed time. Our Fast Hands on average, first reload 65, second reload 65, and on our third reload will be down to just below half of its original reload speed, totaling 181% across all three reloads, which means that Fast Hands will reload on average 68% of our control. And our Gunner build is 100% over 100%. Fast Hands is 100% over the full firing time. It hasn't done anything to that side, but we are now down to 23.8% of total time being consumed with reloading, which means that Fast Hands will grant you 112.6% the output of damage compared with our control. So Fast Hands, 12.6% damage output increase. It is point and shoot, but it is crit chance and hit reliant. So there is an RNG portion to that, and also your ability to actually hit a target. And it is reset on reload. So the value of it actually varies from weapon to weapon, depending on how much time that weapon spends reloading as opposed to firing. So on faster firing weapons, it tends to average out, because faster firing weapons, although they're firing for less time than what a slower firing weapon is, that is balanced generally by their shorter reload times. So the percentages actually stay fairly true, but there is variance between from weapon to weapon. You will get more value from this talent, like most on-hit mechanics at more difficult content, because you are required to fire a greater percentage of your magazine. And this is where faster firing weapons get most of their advantage, in that they are firing more bullets due to lower bullet damage. Unfortunately, it is less effective on builds that already have weapon handling and reload speed. And although we didn't account for it with our control, Gunner also provides you with 10% weapon handling. If we happen to be standing still, the benefit of fast hands is reduced again. But that is also the case for builds with strikers and heartbreakers, which have 15% weapon handling. It's even worse on ongoing directive and Umbra, which both have a 30% reload speed built in. And of course the gunner specialization with its 10% weapon handling and its third reload being 50% faster. So there are some mechanics that will increase the value of fast hands, and there are some mechanics that will decrease its value. But at this point in time, we're saying 12.6% added value from fast hands as far as damage output is concerned, but as opposed to Allegro, which denotes that damage to its firing time, this is in the time in between. So you'll be on to the next target quicker, but you won't notice it at all in time to kill individual enemies. Second last talent for today, because there's a surprise one that comes in with this, but we've got Bread Basket. Landing body shots adds a stack of bonus of plus 35% headshot damage to the next headshot, and it also has a time component being 10 seconds that it will last, and you can stack that up to 3 times. So in order to compare this to a control, we have to add headshot damage onto our control build. To do that, we need to not only work out our normal body shot component, but also our headshot. So on a non-crit headshot, our stock standard is going to be a 420% damage output, so slightly less than our crit damage output, but it's a non-crit, so we're not getting that bonus. On our crit headshots, 787% is going to be our damage output, but we have lost a bit to diminished returns there. Now, so on our standard control build, at a 10% headshot rate, which is what I'm saying is going to be the average if we're doing headshots optimally and not going for them all the time. Watch my headshots build video if you haven't already. 90% of the time, we're doing crits, non-crits. 5.9% of the time now, we're doing crit headshots, and 4.1% of the time we're doing non-crit headshots, meaning that our new control, as far as inclusion of headshots is concerned, is now 474.65 as opposed to the 456 that it was before. So now we have to compare it to our Bread Basket talent. Now the thing about the Bread Basket talent is that it's stacking on top of our headshot damage that we already had. So in the case of normal headshots, we're adding at the 75% mark, and in the case of crit headshots, we're now adding all the way at 220%. So the diminished returns is now less than a third of the value. But let's quickly do that. In a non-crit headshot, we're now doing 180% headshot damage, taking it up to 672. And on a crit headshot, we're now producing over 1,000% over base as far as our output is concerned on those bullets that are doing a crit headshot. Now, if we're absolutely taking the maximum advantage of Bread Basket that we possibly can, 3 body shots to 1 headshot means that we're doing body shots 75% of the time, 14.75% of the time we're doing a crit headshot, and 10.25% of the time we're doing a non-crit headshot. meaning a total average output of 564.65% compared to our new headshot damage control. And that means that Breadbasket is outputting 18.96% more damage than what our control is. But then you realize a few things. If it's possible for me to do 3 body shots and 1 headshot with Breadbasket hasn't given me any extra superhuman abilities to be able to do that. So if I can do 25% headshots with Breadbasket, then I can do 25% headshots without Breadbasket as well. So now if we change our control to being 25% headshots, our new control output for 25% headshots is 501.65. That still means that Breadbasket is adding 12.5% to our damage output. But then what you realize is that if I'm close enough to achieve 25% headshots, I'm doing this. And if I can do this and hit that consistently, then I can probably do this and do way more damage just by doing headshots. It's a completely retarded talent. And on top of that, if you watch some of the previous videos, you realize that that higher bullet damage means you are more likely to kill the enemy. If I've put a series of body shots into an enemy, the last shot that I did, if it is a headshot, which is what Breadbasket is asking you for, if I'd done that with a normal build, there's a very good chance that that headshot would have killed the enemy anyway. So even if this talent worked, it's generally only going to add to overkilling an enemy. So the actual benefit of Breadbasket is, in my opinion, that's actually a negative. But even if you could make it work, it would barely amount to a few percent, if that at all. As far as ease goes, it's impossible to take advantage of this talent. No one's going to flick their weapon between body shots and headshots to take advantage of it. At best, you're going to be using it once per target, and as I've said before, that extra benefit that you get, you probably would have killed the enemy anyway. So there is virtually no value to this target, if not a negative value, and the only thing easy about it is it's easy to ignore. The talent, I honestly believe that the talent was supposed to be this. Landing body shots adds a stack of 35% headshot damage, not for just the next headshot, but for the next 10 seconds. Max stack is 3, and that makes a hell of a lot more sense. Maybe they worked out during testing that this was actually pretty powerful and decided to scale it back to being only 1 headshot, but they've run this to the ground to the point of being an actual detriment to your build. But there is a talent that does exactly what my reimagined version of Breadbasket does, except with less of a time delay, and that comes on the Bighorn. So the Big Game Hunter allows you to stack up to 100% headshot damage, so almost as much as Breadbasket, virtually the same, and its decay is twice as long. So the potential for overall a longer period of damage, especially given what Breadbasket currently is, but even my reimagined version being only 10 seconds long. So at 10% headshots only, the Big Game Hunter is going to add roughly 5% extra damage to your build, or damage output. If you're doing 25% headshots, Big Game Hunter now adds 11.9% to your build. And if you're at 50% headshots, Big Game Hunter will add 22% damage output to your build. Now, I'm not going to break this down excessively, because if you've seen my headshots build video, you'll understand why headshots in normal play going for them is not an optimal strategy. And that revolves around distance to the target and how quickly headshot accuracy or your ability to land rounds on target degrades. But it is worth considering when you factor the distance to the target in. And something that I want to explore in a later episode is the talents that are built in to gameplay. That is, headshots grant 75% additional headshot damage. So if you're doing headshots, that's a 75% increase on damage. Because of diminished returns, that averages to around about 40% additional damage output if you can land headshots consistently. The problem comes with rounds on target. Every missed round on target is going to be more than 2% lost from your damage, which is why going for headshots isn't optimal. If you treat these talents as being proximity talents in the same way that we do close and personal, for instance, these benefits are in addition to whatever talent you have on your weapon. But being closer to an enemy requires a different playstyle and a different build type, and that's something that we are going to explore later on down the track, because there is a massive amount of untapped damage that exists because we've run 6 red builds for so long. We've been missing out on. But that is for another episode. Right now we are looking at what is the most damage that we can produce from our builds in a 6 red format. There are quite a few other talents that we are yet to explore, but that requires a few other investigations beforehand. And right now what we're looking at is finding out what the most damaging build is. The weapon damaging build is currently run between these two builds: a perfect focus striker's build with Coyote's Mask versus a striker's chest with Coyote's Mask. Now obviously perfect focus, in my opinion, is only viable in a legendary environment. We'll investigate heroic damage once we sort out all of the other things. But right now, most damaging build, we need a weapon and a weapon talent to go along with it. And we've investigated all of those damage talents now. And these are the ones that I would consider to be the front runners at this point in time. There's still some decisions to make. We've got Perfect Flatline and Kingbreaker, able to provide between 8.8 up to 20%. But the Kingbreaker is a TKB. And that comes at 625 rounds per minute, which is going to decrease our stacking capabilities for strikers. It's also got a low single target damage value because of its slow reload, but it does have very good sustained damage. Now if we do decide to take Technician and the Link Laser Pointer, it offers an additional skill tier, and it also offers 12% damage to tech and robotics, so that's also something to consider. We then have Flatline, which is, if we're running the Link Laser Pointer, 4.27%, which isn't great at all, but we do have the ability to run a slightly different setup, assigning a skill to Pulse, and that is, we do have the potential to reach 100% uptime, which would give us the full 15% value from that talent. And without the Link Laser Pointer, we then have the option to put that talent onto any weapon that we choose. We've then got Ranger, super easy, 6 to 8% in Heroic, probably not the best there, but in a Legendary, where engagement distances are further, possibly 9 to 13% available on a Ranger. We then probably have the biggest surprise packet out of all of the investigations so far, being In Sync. And the perfectly in sync option, giving 14 to 16% damage, provided that we've got a skill to go along with it. The perfectly in sync version is on a PDR though, 700 RPM, not the best selection for strikers builds. It's got a low single target damage, but it has a pretty reasonable multi-target or sustained damage factor. We then have the option of actually putting In Sync onto any weapon that we choose, providing 11 to 12% benefit there.
skill time dependent. We've got restricted options as far as that goes, but what we also have to add in is increased skill damage as well. We've now got fast hands to add to the mix. Doesn't add to damage, but it does improve the time factor, which increases our overall damage output as a whole. Now, when it comes to legendary, there's more value in the difficult content, but we get more value from lower damage, which is the exact opposite of what we're looking for at the moment, with our highest of damage builds. And it is less effective on builds that have got weapon handling and reload speed, and right now we're running strikers with gunner. So there's less benefit there. We also have, I'm going to put this in as a wild card, measured as a possibility. Currently returning 7% on average. There is less value on total weapon damage talent, so it's not going to help our perfect focus build, but it is offering us 5% faster stacking, and that could be up to 2% additional damage. That's per magazine until we reach our full stacks. And on the Striker's chest build, when I did the testing, it took me one full wave to reach that maximum stack capability. And all the time, Strikers is degrading from its top value, and if we've got measured on there, it means that we're going to be back faster to maximum output quicker. I am not sure which one is going to produce the most value. Put in the comments what you think is going to produce the most damage. Because the next episode, what we're going to look at is skill damage. Because if we're looking for the highest damage output build as a whole, we have two skill slots. Two skill slots that's going to add damage to our overall output. And In Sync has the advantage of increasing that skill damage. Flatline is going to have to sacrifice one of those skills in order to do a non-damage skill. Whereas every other talent has free reign as far as damage output skills are concerned. There's a lot to work through there. And at the end of the day, whatever we put on our weapon has to be able to compete with this juggernaut as it stands. And currently, for both multi-target and single-target DPS, this weapon stands between 7 and 8% clear of any of its rivals. Anything else has got some work to do in order to exceed the damage output of this weapon. Whew, that was a long one. It was a mixed bag for sure, but there is a lot to digest from this episode. And I've got some work to do as far as working out what the highest damage skills are. So if you like this one, hit the like button, subscribe if you want to see more, and I will see you in the skill damage output episode. That's it from me. Fog out.